Hey, it's Rob for Wax Wednesday. Stuff I picked up. Kind of a slower week for me this week. Didn't go too overboard. Only bought three. One of them's a present, so I'm not going to feature that here in case that person is watching. I want to blow the surprise. But I do have two that I'm going to talk about here that I picked up. These two albums kind of have a lineage to the Big Apple, New York City. One more so than the other. Let's start with the other. That being Sid and Nancy, the original motion picture soundtrack album for the movie Sid and Nancy. It's given the subtitle of Love Kills. That's a song title that shows up two different times on this album. One performed by Joe Strummer and a totally different Love Kills performed by the Circle Jerks. Also on this album, a couple of tracks by the Pogues, one of which doesn't sound anything like the Pogues. The Joe Strummer track that I was talking about has that big 80s drum sound, which just annoying. Who else is on this? Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols contributes a track. There's a band on here called Pray for Rain, who are just kind of mediocre, really, but they're the ones that supplied the score for the entire movie. And not the only time Alex Cox, who directed this movie, worked with them. They were also part of another punk project or punk-inspired project he did, Straight to Hell, which featured Joe Strummer in an acting role. But anyway, these were kind of the doomed couple of punk. If you don't know their story, well, Sid comes from England. Nancy was an American. They met over in England. She kind of followed the Sex Pistols over back to America when they went on tour there. They discovered heroin together, or she introduced heroin to Sid, and things go off the rails really, really fast. I'm not a huge fan of Sid Vicious, really. I love the Sex Pistols, but when he joined the band, he added very little other than some cool photo ops. That's about it. And he bought into the image, and it eventually ended up killing him, and allegedly prior to that, him allegedly killing her in one of his hazes. But there are still people out there that say that he was innocent. So, and we'll never know, because a couple of months after the incident, he was in Rikers. He was released, and when he cleaned up relatively in jail, his next dose of heroin was a lethal dose that ended his life. So, tragic ending. But that whole incident between Sid and Nancy took place in the Chelsea Hotel, which is a New York City landmark. So that's why I say it kind of has a New York lineage to it. Sid played a handful of shows with a pickup band, again, in New York City, but only a handful of shows that would feature guys, like a couple of guys from the New York Dolls and just pickup guys. But anyway, and one thing about this this album here, I'll kind of flip it around. When this movie came out, I had the movie poster in one of my apartments on Charlotte Street, and as I would enjoy my morning coffee every day, I would stare at that poster, and over time, this name Chloe Webb kind of stuck out at me. I thought that was a cool name, Chloe, and with that, well, my first daughter was named Chloe, and definitely an influence from this image or this movie poster that the image was made from, that I lived with for a few months back in the, well, 86 when this came out. So anyway, Sid and Nancy, as a soundtrack, it's kind of, so-so. Nothing great. But I didn't pay much for it, so I'm cool. This band has a lot to do with New York City because that's where they're from. And they're a groundbreaking act that kind of came up in the punk scene of 1977, but really they predate that by a good 5 years. They're more contemporaries of the New York Dolls when they would play the Mercer Arts Center before it fell to the ground. What I'm talking about is the two-piece band called Suicide. This is a beautiful reissue from 2019. When I say beautiful, it is pressed on beautiful red wax. I love that. But as for these guys, their footprint is massive. They're an electronic band, a very experimental band. The guitars were not their weapons of choice. It was an electronic pulsy drone. That was the musical backbone of it, fronted by a vocalist named Alan Vega, who kind of had this heavily drenched reverb, hiccupy style, kind of like a Gene Vincent. But in front, while this music was, giving this pulsy sound, which people found irritating or edgy to begin with, you had on vocals Alan Vega standing up there in front, trying to get some sort of fear response from the audience by bullwhipping in their direction, or having a chain as a weapon that he would flick in their direction, just kind of trying to set off some sort of emotion. And Suicide were kind of groundbreaking in that sense, because a lot of riots started out at Suicide shows, and a lot of those riots were based on the music itself and how it made people feel. Anger is an energy. But anyway, Suicide, when you look at bands that followed in their wake, like Psychic TV, Throbbing Gristle, maybe a little later on, you're looking at artists like Ministry and Nine Inch Nails. Well, they all owe a debt to this two-piece act, Suicide, who were, electronic, experimental, kind of industrial, before those terms like really existed. At least on the North American side of things, electronic experimental music was always big, or had been for a while in Europe. But to take it to a street level like these guys did was definitely a first. And they are often unsung as one of those early punk heroes. But they weren't your traditional punk band, but they were definitely a big part of that whole scene, and the reputation that followed it. So that's what I got for this week. I hope y'all have a fantastic week. Go buy some records. It'll make you feel good. Remember, home is where your records are. And we'll be back again next week for another episode of Wax Wednesday, What I Picked Up. I'm Rob. Cheers.